Well, thank you so much for having me. First of all, I get all the emails from the Midtown South Community Council, and I know that it's a really committed group of New Yorkers trying to address homelessness, so it's an honor to be here. Specifically today, I'm here to talk about the House Our Future New York campaign, and I know that this is going to be review for several people in the room, because Picture the Homeless is already a key member of this campaign, Urban Pathways. I believe Charisma spoke at one of our rallies and has also been very active with sharing her story through other mechanisms as well as part of this campaign. And Midtown South Community Council has also endorsed the campaign already formally. So those of you who are not yet signed on, I hope you will consider signing on after this presentation. And for those who have already signed on, if you have other questions or want to get more involved, please do reach out to me. So the House Our Future campaign was started earlier this year, and what we were looking at is the fact that we have persistent record homelessness in New York City. So we have currently about 63,000 people in shelters and thousands more people on the streets. We also have many people who are in privately operated shelters, in addition to that 63,000 number in the city's shelter system. And the de Blasio administration has taken some positive steps to address homelessness. They've done, they implemented the right to counsel and housing court. They've made record commitments to supportive housing, and we're very grateful for those programs. However, it has not actually reduced the number of people in shelters. We have stabilized the shelter census at record numbers, and that's not acceptable. That's not what success looks like in a city as rich as ours with progressive leadership. We should be doing better. So we looked at, okay, noting that some positive steps have been taken and the situation would probably be worse had those steps not been taken, we need to go farther. And what are the tools that the administration is not fully utilizing to address homelessness? The most egregious example of this is the mayor's Housing New York plan. So the mayor had this bold promise to build or preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing. And then last year, he actually said, we're ahead of schedule and we're under budget, so we're going to expand that goal to 300,000 units of affordable housing built or preserved by 2026. This is called Housing New York 2.0. This is huge, right? Because we all know that what the major cause of record homelessness is the lack of affordable housing, and truly affordable housing for people who are on disability, people who may not be able to work for various reasons, or people who are working very low wage jobs, or who have inconsistent work, right? Those are the people who are being pushed out of the rental market entirely. So on its face, 300,000 units of affordable housing sounds really impressive, until you actually look at what that means. So first of all, most of those units are going to be preserved affordable housing. And what that means is that the city is going to be giving certain incentives to extend the affordability agreements of units. So these are units that maybe we're going to be leaving rent regulation, something like that. The administration might step in, give an extension on a tax break, and that unit is going to be preserved affordable. So we're not talking about 300,000 new units of housing. So that's important to note, first of all. Second, out of those 300,000 units, only 15,000 are specifically for people who are homeless and who are coming out of shelters. So if you can do the math quickly in your head, that's 5% of the mayor's plan. So he has this bold affordable housing plan, and he has record homelessness with 63,000 people in shelters, including 23,000 children. And he's saying that he thinks 5% is enough. So the House Our Future New York plan, we did a lot of projections and calculations about what we would actually need in order to reduce homelessness. And what we found would be a feasible, within budget, reasonable ask would be 10% of the affordable housing plan, 10%. So 90% of the plan would still be for people who are not currently in shelters, but 10% of those units in the 300,000 unit plan would be for people who are in shelters so they can move out of shelters and into affordable apartments of their own. So that's 30,000 units. And crucially, we want 24,000 of those units to be created through new construction. The reason is because when you have what's called a homeless set-aside unit that's in a preserved unit, there's already someone in that apartment. So that apartment won't actually be available to someone moving out of shelter until the person who's currently in that apartment moves out. And that might be years down the road. The turnover rate of those apartments is very low, as it should be, because the whole point is that you're preserving the affordability so people aren't displaced. So what we really need is more new construction units for homeless households. So that's the gist of the plan, is we're asking for 10% of the affordable housing plan, with the vast majority of those units to be created through new construction. And specifically, I don't want to make it seem like we're asking for those units to be taken away from other extremely low-income people, right? The affordable housing plan is currently subsidizing about 10% of the units in that plan are for people who are making 6 figures or more income. So these are rents that are going to be at over $2,500 per month. So we're saying, instead of subsidizing rents for people who don't have as extreme housing needs, people who would be able to find rents on the private market without the help of the city government, why aren't we taking some of those units and putting them into the lowest income band, specifically for people who are homeless and extremely low income? So that's, I want to clarify, we're not talking about pitting one group of low income people against another group of low income people. This is about, those units up at the top that we're calling affordable housing aren't actually affordable. And also, frankly, the demand for those units is not nearly as great as the units at the lower end. So we have the money, we just need the political will to actually be shifting those priorities to where the need is greatest. So we launched this campaign. In January, we released a white paper showing that Mayor Koch had actually done 10% of his affordable housing plan for homeless people. So why can't Mayor de Blasio match that at a time when the need is much greater and more urgent? And then we started collecting organizational partners. And right now, I know it says that it's 59 organizations on the half sheet that went around. I'm not sure if that made it around, but you can keep passing it around at the table. We're actually up to 61 organizations that have already endorsed this campaign. And these are organizations, like I said, that range from Picture the Homeless and Urban Pathways, Midtown South Community Council. Many faith groups are involved as well. Some housing developers are involved, because this is such a common sense ask, right? 10% of this historic plan to address record homelessness. We also, in June, a group of 38 elected officials, including 32 council members, 4 borough presidents, the public advocate, and the comptroller, sent a letter supporting this campaign to Mayor de Blasio. So that means that basically most progressive leaders in New York City, with the exception of the mayor, understand that this is a common sense solution and this is an urgent need. I know Speaker Johnson had said informally that he thinks that it's a very reasonable campaign, because obviously we need more affordable housing for homeless people. It's pretty common sense. And the mayor has persistently refused to accept this very reasonable campaign, because he says that his affordable housing plan is for everyone. Yes, it's true that everyone in New York City says that New York City is not affordable enough. However, the affordability crisis is not felt the same by someone who is making 6 figures and who is already in an apartment, and someone who is in a homeless shelter tonight. For people who have been stuck in shelters for more than a year on average because they can't find an affordable apartment, even if they have a housing voucher that would help them pay their rent, they still can't find an affordable apartment. To say that the affordability crisis is felt equally by those people and by someone making $120,000 a year is just an egregious lie. So we're continuing to pressure the mayor until he agrees to change his housing plan. We think it's very reasonable. We had a New York Kids Need Housing March in June, where we had more than 100 children, including many who are currently in shelters, build Lego houses and march to City Hall and deliver the houses to the mayor and say, if we can build housing, why can't you? Last month, we marched on Gracie Mansion, and that's where Charisma spoke very eloquently about her experiences and why we need more affordable housing for people like her to move out of shelters and into apartments. We've been calling into the Brian Lair show every Friday when the mayor is on Ask the Mayor. We have asked him multiple times why he won't agree to this ask. He hasn't really given us a good reason other than this very blanket thing that he thinks he's doing enough already and that he's comfortable with his current plan. One of our activists confronted the mayor when he was working out at the Park Slope gym, asked him this question. Some of you may have seen that video. His response was a non-response. He got up and ran away from a 72-year-old homeless woman. And And yeah, we think that, we're really committed to keeping up with this campaign because, number one, the problem is not going away. And number two, it is unconscionable that our elected officials should be satisfied and comfortable with this crisis. 63,000 people in shelters, 23,000 kids are going to be spending Thanksgiving in shelters. And that's something that none of us should be comfortable with. So we're going to keep pushing with this campaign. We are going to have some upcoming rallies. We've also been vocally supportive of a new bill by City Council member Rafael Salamanca. It's called Intro 1211. And that would sort of get us a long way toward the House Our Future NY goal. So again, our goal is 10% of the housing plan overall. And he introduced legislation that would be mandating that any development that gets city financing would have to set aside a minimum of 15% of those units for homeless households. So that's on a development level, it would be 15% of the units, and that would go a long way toward getting us to those 24,000 new construction units out of the 300,000 unit plan. So these things kind of go hand in hand, and we are going to be doing a lot of advocacy in the coming months to ensure that that bill gets passed, because the City Council has been a really valuable partner in this campaign. They have to deal with the ramifications of homelessness every day in their districts. They have constituents who have lost their homes coming to their offices every day. And I think that everyone really sees this as a common sense solution to actually reducing homelessness in New York City. So are there any questions? I know that's a lot of numbers. Hopefully you can. We also have on our website, if you go to coalitionforthehomeless.org/HOFNY or House Our Future NY, you can see some great photos from our past actions. You can sign a petition that we have on there. Your organization can endorse the campaign formally if you have not already done so. And you can also, most importantly, we have a section called Voices, where you can see people who are currently in shelter or who were in shelter for a very long time and have finally been able to find housing, talking about why this campaign is so important. I think updating the numbers every month with how many people are in the municipal shelter system is an interesting task, because you see every month the numbers are either going up or they're not going down. And to say, okay, we had 22,500 kids in shelter last month, now we're up to 23,000. It's easy to just get lost in these numbers because they're so huge. But the way that you have to contextualize it is that if everyone who was in just a municipal shelter tonight in New York City went to Yankee Stadium, they would fill every single seat, and about 14,000 more would have to stand. Just the scale of this crisis, and that's just the city shelter system. That's not counting people on the streets. That's not counting people who were sleeping in drop-in centers or who are in faith-based shelters. And once you recognize the magnitude of this crisis, it becomes really difficult to just sit back and say, okay, you're right, we're doing enough, this is fine. We should be grateful for the progress that's made so far. When we talk about the 63,000 people in shelter, and there's detailed methodology on our website with where exactly which populations are included in that number, that's just the shelters that are overseen by the Department of Homeless Services. And many of them are operated by nonprofit providers, but they're DHS shelters. So then there's a separate Department of Youth and Community Development oversees shelters for runaway and homeless youth. Those are not included in that 63,000 number. We have thousands of people on the street. We don't know how many. The city claims it's about 4,000. We know it's much more than that because of issues with how they count. Those people are not included in that number. So if you actually looked at the full census of every homeless person in New York City, it would probably be closer to 80,000. Plus, we have many more people who are doubled up. And numbers came out that last school year, there were 114,000 homeless New York City school children over the course of the last school year. And that's including children who are both in the shelter system and who are doubled up, so sleeping on a family member's couch or something like that because their family does not have the money for a home of their own. So we track the numbers of people in the DHS shelter system month by month because it's easier for comparison purposes. Mm-hmm. But you can see that even just looking at that population, this is a crisis unto itself. Our tax dollars should be spent where the need is the greatest. And are we subsidizing rents for people making six figures, or are we subsidizing rents for people who would otherwise be in an incredibly costly shelter system? That's the other component of this. We are spending about $2 billion a year, I believe now, on shelters, on emergency shelters. And we need to be thinking about long-term, how do we will always have a need for some shelters, I think, because people will have immediate crises. But why are people having to stay in shelters for more than a year because they can't find affordable housing? How do we reduce the need for shelters? We don't need, 600 shelters around the city if we can actually move people out of shelters and into permanent housing much faster. It would save money in the long run, as well as just being the compassionate thing to do. We think that given the magnitude of this problem, asking for 10% of an affordable housing plan to be dedicated to the people who have the greatest housing needs, who are people without housing, is not unreasonable. It's a very pragmatic goal, and we think it's very achievable with the investments that have been made to date. We know that the actual need is much greater than that, but we wanted to say something that is realistic and that the mayor should have no legitimate reasons refusing this goal, and yet he has continued to do so. So we're asking for 30,000 units to be homeless set aside. So that's twice as many as the administration is currently set aside for homeless people in their plan. Yeah. But out of those 30,000 units, we want 24,000 of them, which is the vast majority, to be new construction, not preservation units. And that's because when a building is newly built, that is a vacant unit that someone can move into out of a shelter, as opposed to a preservation unit. It's almost more theoretical about when someone may be able to, if that person decides to move out of that unit in 10 years, then in theory, a person would be able to move out of a shelter and into that apartment. But that's not actually helping people move out right now. Yeah. We want these 30,000 units out of the affordable housing plan to be in addition to the supportive housing units that the mayor has already committed to. Supportive housing is like Urban Pathways operates supportive housing, for example. That is permanent housing with on-site support services for folks who are dealing with mental illness, substance use, or other issues. And after a multi-year campaign, we succeeded in getting Mayor de Blasio and then separately Governor Cuomo to commit to a total of 35,000 units of supportive housing over 15 years. So 15,000 financed by the city and 20,000 by the state. That was a long campaign. People thought that was, pie in the sky, and we were able to actually achieve that. And now we're watching some of those units come online. They need to be coming online faster, but that's a separate issue. So these Housing New York 2.0 units, part of the House Our Future NY campaign, those units are for folks who don't necessarily need supportive housing. These are people who maybe they might have a job, but they just can't afford rent, even with their job. About a third of the families in shelter have someone who is working. So they just need an affordable apartment. They don't need robust support services in the same way that someone who's eligible for supportive housing might. So, whenever the mayor responds to our campaign, he sometimes conflates the supportive housing numbers and the number of people who have been prevented from entering shelter, and he throws a bunch of numbers out there, and you kind of have to sift through them a little bit to make sense of, but you haven't actually agreed to the ask of 10% of the housing plan for homeless people. That's the bottom line.
Okay.
Wow, great.
Anybody else would like to add to this?
I just have a question. What are the circumstances under which a homeless family in a shelter eventually vacate the shelter?
Mm-hmm.
Do they get a job that they didn't have, or do they find an inexpensive apartment?
Yeah, it's a variety. Every household is different, and the reasons that caused their homelessness are different. For some people it might have been domestic violence, for example, as a main driver of homelessness. So maybe they were in an affordable apartment and had to leave it because it wasn't safe there for them, and they might just need an affordable place, and they were able to find another affordable apartment.
Because they presumably have a job.
Sometimes some people have employment income. Some people have vouchers that help subsidize their rents up to a certain level. Some people have disability benefits or other benefits that maybe they didn't have access to before, and in theory, caseworkers at the shelter are supposed to help them access those benefits to increase their income. There is, and then there's also the job training component. So some people do increase their income while they're in shelter, but I think also when you recognize that a lot of people already have income and are in shelters, because the gap between incomes and rents is just so astronomical in this city that usually it's not just about, oh, you need to get a better paying job and then you can be self-sufficient in this rental market. You know, the National Low Income Housing Coalition puts out a report every year called Out of Reach, and they calculate what hourly wage you would need to make to comfortably pay for an apartment at the fair market rent. So a very basic apartment, not one that's a luxury apartment, but not one that's dilapidated. And in New York City, you would have to earn about $30 an hour, working 40 hours a week to comfortably afford a fair market rent apartment. So clearly it's not just about increasing people's wages, because we fought so hard to get the $15 minimum wage. I don't really know whether we can get it up to $30 an hour. So it has to be both sides of the equation, right? Increasing incomes, but also making more deeply affordable housing that people can realistically afford. The mayor could tomorrow say, I'm adjusting the housing plan so that we're going to have 10% of the units for homeless people, including 24,000 new construction, and that is our goal. That is something that the mayor has the authority 100% to do. He's already made increased investments in the housing plan, so we actually think that there is a significant amount of investment there. Now, the financing for how that works out on a development by development scale is kind of complicated, because, you know, what is the upper income rent in that building? Can that be used to cross subsidize the lower income units, or would it require more capital subsidy? That's more of like the nitty gritty on each development. But when we're talking about the whole housing plan, it's 100% within the authority of the mayor to just change the goals of the plan. And he's done that in the past for other populations. And also the city council, 32 council members have endorsed this campaign. So they have fully said that they are willing to make more investments in the housing plan if it means more units for homeless people, more people who are actually in shelters in that $2 billion shelter system, to move them out of shelters and into permanent housing. You know, it's completely reasonable for them to do that.